James Day, public television pioneer and chairman of the CUNY TV Advisory Board, passed away in April 2008. His legacy includes the series Day at Night, which aired for 130 episodes beginning in 1973. The program features interviews with many of the great thinkers and achievers of the 20th century. These 30-year-old programs have been restored. The interviews remain fresh and relevant today, exploring issues that are still important to society. Showing them again is CUNY TV's tribute to Jim and his contributions to public television.
Marya is a writer whose books and essays are characterized by a sharp satirical wit and a high sense of righteous indignation over the world's absurdities and wrong-headedness. Her most recent book, Last Rites, stands as an example. It treats the controversial and sensitive subject of death, of one's right to choose to die with dignity when death is inevitable. That's just the latest target. Over the years, she's leveled her verbal guns against the desecration of our environment, the enslavement of women, the victimizing of the consumer, and the trivialization of television, all before they became popular causes. In addition to her several books of essays and frequent articles for magazines, she's the author of 2 novels, Message from a Stranger and They, the latter having been adapted for public television several seasons ago.
Marya, in your autobiography, Out of My Time, you use the device of an internal dialogue with a male character who's identified as your male component. Do all of us have a male and female component?
Well, that was really one of the purposes of the book. I think that in each woman there are what used to be called masculine qualities, and in each man there are the female, that we are really, there's a duality there. Now, it might be 70% to 30, depending on if you're a woman.
It differs with different people.
It differs with different people, but I'm firmly convinced, and in my case, I had made up, when I was very young, this man, Wohlleben, very funny name, but then it was a German-oriented, at least my mother had been German, who did all the things that I really wanted to do.
And you actually made him up as a child,
I made him up as a child, but I didn't write about him, of course, fairly recently. He was the adventurer in me. He was the one that, and in this book, actually, this was before we hit the moon. He got there. He was wandering around the glaciers on the moon. And he was quite a fellow. And we had long dialogues. He asking me why I was, being such a stoop and marrying this guy, marrying another guy when I wouldn't have to, and I saying, well, I one thing and another. It was the two in me, because in those days, to be ambitious, to be all these things that are normally to want leadership, so forth. It was always called aggressive. She's an aggressive woman. You never say that that's good for a man to be aggressive, but it was hell on wheels for a woman then. And I think the young men, although I fortunately was not unpleasing to look at, they were slightly scared of me, because they knew that under all this lurked quite a strong machine.
Has that changed?
No. I have become, let's say, that the corners have been rubbed off a bit. I'm much less, I may be aggressive in what I write, in the sense that I say things that very often people don't want to hear 5 years before everybody else does. Don't ever be, or you couldn't be a Cassandra, but the profit side of, and that's P-H-E-T, because I've never made any profits in my life. was bad for timing. And I think that's why I really never was a popular writer, because I made people uneasy.
Timing is the essence, then.
Timing,
of doing things at the right time.
Timing, and I hope talent. And then there's another third quality that makes the successful anything, and that's arrogance. You have to believe within yourself that you really have private access to the truth, that you are a better writer than most people. And this is, I have found, very hard to do.
Why do you believe so strongly that arrogance is so necessary?
Because I've watched the people who get to the top. Now, I'm not saying this necessarily means that you are a great writer or a great artist, but if it's a public acceptance. And to gain that, of course, there are other reasons now. And for a long time, unless you could write sex and violence in large dollops, you were usually remaindered, no matter how exquisitely you wrought your ideas. But that, I hope, I rather think, maybe a bit lowered now.
Do you think that your success in what you've chosen to do would have been greater had you been born a man?
At an earlier stage in my career, yes. I was suspect, where now I wouldn't be suspect at all. I was saying things that a sort of decent, typical woman wouldn't say. I was being too free and easy, too dashing, both in my personal life and in my writings. So although I had a small, loyal band of admirers and readers, I was never, let's say, Jacqueline Suzanne. I don't think that I really want to be, but I wouldn't mind having a little bit of the...
Does that tell us more about the times,
Yes.
or about ourselves?
I think it tells us about both, because we make the times as a nation, as a society. And, well, you know this more than anybody. Jim, you've been so much in the middle of all kinds of media. And there is unquestionably a tremendous surge of desire in the American for violence and sex. And violent sex could be termed either violation or pornography. And I mean, I'm not again it. I think the Supreme Court decision was very foolish. And I think one has to have access to anything. It depends on what kind of person you are, whether it really does get to you or change you, or whether you look at it as just one more manifestation.
You grew up in a very civilized, very cultured home here in New York. All this, what you're talking now, seems so remote from the atmosphere, the environment in which you grew up.
Well, it is very remote, and I was terribly lucky. And now it's interesting, young people who for so long didn't want to know anything about the past, never saw their grandparents, hated to read history. So there's a very marked change as I go around the universities. Anyway, I was very lucky. I had musicians for parents and a brother who was also a musician and an inventor. So there was a great richness of texture. I heard the best music since I was 3. Played at home with people like Casals used to come and play trios. I mean, this is unbelievable to have as a child. And they gave me, within the bounds of a strict discipline, an ethical discipline, they gave me great freedom.
How did they give you great freedom?
Well, for instance, this is typical when you consider how long ago this was. I think when I was 10, my father, he used to have heart-to-heart talks with me, treating me as a human being. And he said, look, don't put any ceilings on yourself. And I understood what he meant. He said, you can be anything you want to. The main thing is to want to.
Even though you are a woman?
That was left unsaid, but he knew perfectly well there was a chorus outside who were criticizing me for wanting to do this and to do that, and generally being a bit bumptious. And mother, who came from a more or less disciplinarian German background, really had to be the balancer. She wouldn't take much nonsense from me, but when I finally grew up and made a slight fool of myself over a growing fascination with gentlemen, she held hands off unless I really did something that she thought was unnecessary.
You've said that you're physically and emotionally, your parents could not have been more different.
They couldn't have been more different, yet I've never known two people so totally welded. Because
both musicians, as you
both
said.
Musicians, and they played sonata together, performed as professionals both here and in Europe. They were never away from each other and didn't want to be, and yet they were in themselves. I mean, father was the dreamer. He's a beautiful man and irresistible to women, which sometimes upset mother, she was a remarkable person herself, but she had precision, clarity, and with a sense of management, and that's why the school came into being.
The Mannes School for
the
music.
Mannes School, which is now the Mannes College. They decided that the teaching of music was not half as good as it should be, and they themselves were both teachers as well as performers. So, with the kindness of some friends who backed them, they started this as a school, and it finally turned into a college.
Your mother, of course, was Clara Damrosch.
Yes, mother was
Sister
of Walter Damrosch, who was my favorite uncle, because he was so...
I was going to ask you about him. What kind of a man was he? I guess most of us of our generation remember him rather well for his music appreciation.
On the radio.
Yes.
He was the first person really to use radio as a source of education, and particularly music education. And all over the country, I mean, even now when I go and speak in various places, I said, you know, as a child, I listened to your uncle. Well, Walter Damrosch was not only, of course, highly musical as a conductor mostly of opera, but also of symphonies later, orchestral works. He was a marvelous showman, which he was the only real showman in the family. He adored the public. He adored people. He loved the manipulation of 100 men, and he knew...
One of whom was your father for a time, was he not?
Yes, my father was concertmaster in what was then the New York Symphony, and that's where he fell in love with a beautiful blonde soprano, I think in Beethoven's Ninth, who he had no idea that she was the sister of his conductor, so it was one of these romantic things. Poor boy from Hell's Kitchen, with no schooling whatsoever, marries the daughter of Juncker family. I'm happy to say it, I'd like to say it very quickly, that as time went on and the First and Second Wars, nobody could have been more outraged by Germany than my mother and my other relatives. I mean, outraged by what was happening.
Marya, in this environment, of musical environment, musicians there all the time, your mother and father musicians, your brother,
yes,
a very fine musician.
Yes.
Why didn't you take up music?
Because I had one extraordinary flash of insight. I realized I had no talent. I had 10 years of it. I played the piano. I was given very good teachers, and I learned harmony and solfege and all that. And
once
what
played the
came
bugle.
out, I suddenly, not suddenly, but the more I heard myself, and then I heard, you know, at night, the great people play, including. It's no good. So at 17, I made a public declaration. They always kidded me because I was dramatic. They called me the tragedy queen. So the three of them were sitting around. We always had dinner together. We talked incessantly, and that's where you learn. We were not a snack family. But I finally got up and cleared my throat at the age of 16 or 17 and said I would like to make an announcement. So they had a hard time keeping a straight face. And I said, I am going to do something that doesn't make any sound. And I said, no noise, no sound. And one of them said, I assume that means you're not going to be a musician. And I said, that's right. I said, I am going to write. Well, past the next 20, 30 years, when they were still alive, and I was blowing in print all over the place, making noise, they never let me forget it. So you're the one that wasn't going to make a noise.
At some point you announced you were not going to college.
And at a later point, yes, I announced that I was not going to college, although I was a terrific grind. I got very high marks at a sort of lycée, and I was requested by 4 of the 7 sisters, which stunned my parents. However, it stunned them that I didn't want to go. And they said, but why? I mean, think of it. I mean, we can scrape up the money somehow. Don't worry about that. I said, really not. Thank you very much. I said, I cannot stand being 4 more years with women or girls. Yes. And they said, you know, you're probably crazy, but we do understand you. Well, what do you want to do? I said, I want to go on my own, away from you. I love you. I always will love you, but I want to find out what I am, all alone. And then again, very rare in that day, they arranged for me to live with a couple in London who they knew would sort of keep a slight guard on me. And I had an absolutely splendid year.
Those were happy years, weren't they?
Very happy, in which I learned, well, I said, I want to live. Well, I did. No, I was very, very lucky in so many ways that whatever has happened to me, I cannot blame on anybody but myself.
I was fascinated by the fact that you met the people you met while you were in Europe as a young woman. Galsworthy, for example?
Yes, and Chesterton, and well, because I was an oddity. In the first place, I was an American. I was fairly literate for an American. I spoke easily because I couldn't stop. The ideas just came pouring out. So I became a kind of a pet of my vast superiors. They always said, you know, well, do bring her along. You know, she's fun and so forth. And I find myself in this exalted company. My goodness, I mean, to have Galsworthy come up and shake hands with me and say, how was I doing and what did I want to write? Well, I nearly fainted. And, no, it was Chesterton and, but I don't know, there were
Scott
also
Fitzgerald.
Scott Fitzgerald, yes, was a little later on. And it happened the same way. He came up to introduce himself to my father and me. And beautiful young man. Of course, I knew who he was, but Father didn't.
This was a kind of a pickup, in a sense, wasn't it?
A pickup, but with due proprieties. And he asked Father whether he could borrow me for the evening. They were going on a party, him and Zelda, and a few other people. And I was nudging Father so desperately that I think he had a cracked rib. Anyway, he said, we called each other Sir. He said, Sir, you may have my daughter for the evening if you promise on your word of honor as a gentleman that no matter what the rest of you do, you get her back here before midnight. And Fitzgerald bowed and said, Sir, you have my promise. It was all very formal.
He did get you back.
He did get me back, but not after incredible things happened. I mean, I saw the Fitzgerald at the apogee of their, I don't know what you call it, but uninhibited glory, to the extent that at the restaurant we all went to, Casino, Zelda suddenly got quite drunk. Even I could see that. And went on the table, lifted her skirts up to her shoulders and started to dance. And I've never seen anything like that at home, certainly not in the theater. I tried to keep my cool, but poor Scott was very worried about it, and they had a very difficult time getting her off the table. And after that, she ran to the front of the casino and hid under the rug. Oh. So at that moment, Scott signaled to a friend of his, a man, said, I want you to take Marya home. It's a little before midnight, but I think she'd better go.
Marya, what did you learn about yourself in that time you spent in Europe? Very important years.
I learned that I didn't, which was very useful for me, that in spite of my positiveness, I really didn't know very much. I learned about all sorts of different people. I learned about labor politics. I was in a very strong labor movement thing. I was fascinated. It's the first time I really understood what some people were doing with about their government, or what they hoped would be the government. I learned about different mores. I'd gone to Parliament to see how they conducted things there. I was taken and was fascinated. I learned the ways of the man, which nobody had ever told me, my mother least of all. And needless to say, it was slightly adventurous.
Yes.
But on the whole, extremely stimulating. And I came back only slightly wiser, but fed up to ear with visions of a dashing future, which was definitely geared to writing by that time. I decided I wasn't a good enough sculptor, although I did a lot of sculpture later on just for my own satisfaction. But I decided that I desperately wanted to get at that thing known the truth. I really mean, I said it to myself in these words. I mean, how naive can you get? Yes. So I'd read an awful lot, and I kept reading an awful lot, and I tried the styles of several exalted people of the past and the present, and then finally, slowly seemed to sort of develop some peculiar way of looking at things and writing about them. And got
you don't know how or why that peculiar way developed. I suppose it was a series of circumstances and changes within you.
I think it was also a sense of inner freedom that allowed me to, I suppose you could call it a form of arrogance, but I felt, why shouldn't I say things in my own way? I am myself. I think I know a little about myself. And I see things. I was constantly looking for things in people, in countrysides. I was an avid watcher of life. And also wanted to be more than a watcher. I wanted to be involved. Boy, was I.
Unfortunately, there isn't even time to go through some of the fascinating involvements, including the years during the war, when you were a kind of spy.
A kind of spy, sir. I was in counterintelligence for the OSS. So there.
I did want to ask you, though, because you've brought up this matter of the duality, the fact that inside you were, in a sense, two persons, that one, the aggressive, intelligent one, almost had to be blunted in your relations with men because you frightened them off.
Well, I discovered that. I couldn't understand why, because I never wanted to compete. That was the great mistake. Because we wanted to be something didn't mean we wanted to compete with men. But there's no question that I had to go very piano with at least two of my husbands. I know it sounds terrible, but I realized that if I expressed myself too much, that it would blunt their egos.
What is your view on marriage today?
Well, it's if I feel this looser arrangement, I think marriage is fine if the two involved are old enough to know themselves personally, individually, as individuals. I mean, I'm very much for learning to live with a man over a period of time before even thinking of marriage. And of course, if they're children, it's probably a much more sensible way to make the pattern. But on the other hand, I'm delighted to see around me friends who are living very happily together without being married, who prefer it that way. They may change their minds, but I am all for this individual choice of how to live your life, as long as it gives, if children are the issue, and I hope fewer rather than many for obvious reasons, then it's absolutely essential that they have the male and the female to guide their earlier days. I think that, and to give a sort of wholeness.
Recently, you've been giving a good deal of thought to death as well as life. And I wanted to ask you, since your most recent book deals with the right to die with dignity, do you put dignity above life itself?
Well, you see, I don't put it above life itself because I have the highest regard for life, which is the functioning human being. I do not call life a body was strung up on life support systems with no chance of ever becoming a whole human being or having a life. I've seen enough of them in terminal wards in the fetal position, facing the wall day after day, to know that this is not a life, and that if that's the reason for the living will, which I make quite a lot of at the end of the book, that you can at least, although it isn't legal yet, I think it will be legal before too long, document saying in the event, I have no brain, I have I'm totally incapable of...
That will require a change in law.
It will require a change in the law, but I think when it is, it ought to be signed every year. It's sent to your lawyer, your doctor, and so forth. So everybody knows what you, as a rational human being, wished for yourself. And it can be different for each human being. Even now, I think it has moral weight, because if people love you, they're not against your deepest will. Now, you can revoke that. If 1 year you say, I'll take life on any terms, you just cancel your last statement.
But below that law, of course, is moral law, superstition, fear, religion, all the things that through the years will be much more difficult to change than
well,
the law
it's going
itself.
to be very difficult to change unless it is completely rightly understood. I find that so many people are automatically horrified, for instance, at the word euthanasia. It's like mass killing. They bring up Nazis and everything. Euthanasia is purely and simply the Greek for the good or gentle death.
Let me ask you in this final minute, not about death, but about life itself. What have you found most precious about life?
Love and work. And by love, I mean loving and being loved by human beings. And the other is constant activity and the work that you want to do.
That's something more, I suppose, than the work ethic, that work is good in its own right?
In its own right, anything that absorbs you, anything that, although however difficult, you choose for yourself, being productive maybe is the easiest way.
Being a useful human being.
Well, first being a loving human being, and then being a useful human being.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.